Hi BookTube, this is my worst reads of 2019. I read 106 books in 2019. I had 2 one-star reads on Goodreads. That means they were hate reads, because if I read a book that I suspect may be a one-star read, typically I would DNF it. But one of them is a novel. It was a thriller. The other one is nonfiction. The thriller, I stayed with it because at the end of a thriller, there's usually a bang of a payoff. That was not the case with this book. And with the nonfiction book, that was a book that was a typical case of fear of missing out, because it was all over BookTube. I wanted to read it. I wanted to form my own opinions, so I finished it. And that book is going to be in this video. The other book I'm going to include is the most disappointing read I had last year. And I will be comparing that book to an important book that matches up with it, and you'll understand why. So I'm actually going to start with that one. I'm going to start with the most disappointing read of 2019. I could get skewered for this, or I could have a whole bunch of people who agree with me. And I think I already do, because I've watched enough videos of people's disappointing reads, and I've watched enough reviews to know that not everybody loved this book. And that is Margaret Atwood's The Testaments. Yeah, this is a book written 34 or 35 years after the original Handmaid's Tale. And I'm going to hold that one up because this is one of the books I love one of the books of all time that I love as a 5-star read. I read this one twice last year in order to discuss it, and I read it when it first came out 35 years ago. This is the better book. This book is one of my most disappointing. I've had a few. There were a few 2-star reads last year, and many of them were books that I had high hopes for, but were very disappointing. I just didn't want to make this video very long because I had other things I want to concentrate on. Margaret Atwood continued the story of The Handmaid's Tale in The Testaments, which was set 16 years later after Offred was, The Testaments is set 15 years after Offred escapes Gilead, and it is the perspectives of Aunt Lydia, who we meet in The Handmaid's Tale, and 2 young women, one of whom is embedded and lives in and was born and raised in Gilead, and another who lives outside of this society in an existence. She's 16 years old. She's a high school student, and she lives with a couple who she believes are her parents, but they seem to be wildly overprotective. They move a lot. They have some shady relationships with friends of her parents. And so Atwood describes those 3 women. I have to say, before I get going even deeper in these books, there will be spoilers. So if you do not want any spoilers, if you have not read these books, go to a different video, turn mine off, don't watch, because I'm going to be spoiling almost all of these books. So The Testaments details Aunt Lydia's existence in Gilead. She is somewhat of a triple agent. She is trying to take down Gilead, and it details who is raised in Gilead is basically groomed and raised to be a wife of a commander. She doesn't want that life. She doesn't choose that path, so she chooses to go into the training and the life of becoming an aunt. The third young woman, third woman of the story, is a woman who lives in Canada, a young high school student who lives in Canada, who lives outside of Gilead, and she ends up protesting the life of Gilead and what women have to endure there. Her life takes a sudden turn where her parents are killed, and you soon realize that she is the baby that was born to Offred, who escaped Gilead and was taken into Canada, but she was not raised by her mother. She was raised by an underground family, a set of parents. There's the story. There's the spoilers. the young woman who was raised in Gilead is the daughter that Offred had to relinquish. And in The Handmaid's Tale, it's never clear what Offred's real name was, but in the Hulu TV show, her name was June, and she was played by Elizabeth Moss. So here are my issues and why I was so disappointed with this book. First of all, the amount of hype it received and the amount of coattails it rode on from The Handmaid's Tale was obvious. It just clearly did not live up to it being billed as a sequel. Why Margaret Atwood believed that a sequel needed to come out 35 years later was suspect to me, and it made me believe that she was pandering to the TV viewership, and she either felt she needed or wanted to expound on The Handmaid's Tale in order to either support or refute what was happening in the TV show. The book does not match the TV show. I watched the first 2 seasons of the Hulu show, and the first season follows The Handmaid's Tale pretty, not exactly, but very close and very closely to the book. After that, it's a made-up story. But The Handmaid's Tale is a brilliant book. It's one of the, I think it's the mothership of dystopian fiction. And for whatever reason why The Testaments was written to support The Handmaid's Tale as its sequel was unnecessary. And I felt like, and I wrote in my Goodreads review of The Testaments, it was Margaret Atwood's fan fiction to herself. Clearly fan fiction, which I don't enjoy, but it was not written in the same way, the same skill as The Handmaid's Tale, which was quite off-putting because it's the same author. Margaret Atwood is a master of fiction. And I had a hard time justifying the different styles of writing. I think she tried very hard to write young women in a way that just did not match how young women speak or act. And that came across in a very clunky way. Aunt Lydia's story was interesting, and wanting to find out where she was coming from emotionally and mentally, what her background was, which is different than what the show depicts. But again, the show is a fictionalized account and an expansion of the story. The writing is so different and so clumsy, and the book is interspersed with big words that were spoken by the young women of the book. They would never use those words. They would never talk that way. And it was, to me, it was jarring, and it sets up a brick wall in the story that the reader hits. And it pulls you out of the story so that you have to work yourself up to sink back into it again. That's not what a novel is supposed to do. It did not live up to the hype. It did not live up to my expectations of Margaret Atwood's writing. I did not believe The Handmaid's Tale ever needed a sequel. The way it ended with such ambiguity was talented, and I was thrilled and satisfied and happy with that ending. Some of the best novels end with an ending that is not definite. It's not a wrap-up. It's not happily ever after. And that's one of the things about The Handmaid's Tale that was its expertise. This was a 2-star read for me. I finished the book. It's readable, but I was not impressed with it. And it's very disappointing because of the amount of hype this book received. A contemporary thriller novel, and it is Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. I don't read thrillers very often. I do enjoy them when I want a break, when I want a palate cleanser, or when I want something that's going to be, I'm going to be able to sit there and read it all the way through, and I'm not going to want to put it down. It's a page turner, and I feel like I read it and I don't blink, that I just want to see, I want to read, I want to feel, I want to know what happens immediately. So that's why I picked up this book. It's the story of Louise, who is a single mother working as a secretary or an assistant to a man named David. And at the very beginning of the book, she meets this man in a bar, and they don't enter into an affair at this point, but they share a passionate kiss outside in an alleyway or something. And she feels sparks, and she thinks that David feels the same way. And so she's had a little too much to drink, and she, gets home, and she's consumed with thoughts of this man that she shared this passionate kiss with in the bar. She goes to her job, and there is a new, I think it's either a temp job or the boss is new. The boss ends up being this man named David who she kissed in an alley of a bar. So it's a little bit of a coincidental thing, and they end up having a conflict. She what's the word I'm looking for? She asserts herself and talks to him about, she thought they shared something together. A lot of misunderstanding, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of shadiness. Somehow, as she's taking her son to school, she bumps into Adele, who is kind of a new woman in town. Louise bumps into her, knocks her over, something clumsy happens, and they end up forming a friendship because Adele says that she doesn't know a lot of people, she doesn't get out much. They go to have coffee, and a friendship ensues. Soon, it is discovered that Adele is David's wife. So Louise is working for David and befriending Adele, and the three of them don't know about each other, you believe. Come to find out, it becomes very clear very quickly that Adele is quite mentally ill, or you believe she's psychotic or sociopathic or something. There's a lot of narration from her where you're like, this lady is messed up. And so the story continues. You learn the backstory. You learn Adele's backstory. She comes from a wealthy family. Her parents died in a fire at their mansion/castle. There's a lot of questions as to if Adele had any part in it. On and on and on. Louise and David's relationship continues to develop. Adele is aware that it's developing. She's making some sort of arrangements and plans. And Adele, in her background, had been sent to a psychiatric facility and meets a teenage boy there, and they form a extremely close friendship. Here's where the story devolves, and it comes out that Louise has these vivid dreams, and it feels like she's leaving her body, and she can fly to different places, and she can see different situations, and her dreams are so vivid. Sometimes she wakes up in different places. Sometimes she wakes up staring at her son as he's sleeping. It goes on and on. In the backstory of Adele and this boy she meets at the hospital, come to find out there's, some crazy diary where he's able to do the same thing about leaving his body. He's trying to teach Adele how to do this. They leave their bodies, they can fly around. There's a lot of experimentation. Adele and Louise discover they can both do the same thing. They have trouble sleeping. It goes on and on. The climax of the book at the very end, and the reason that the title of the book is Behind Her Eyes, is that Louise is a pawn. Adele isn't actually Adele. The girl Adele was killed by this boy she met at the hospital. He took over her body, and he's the soul and the personality of Adele, and he's gay, and he's trying to have a relationship with David, who he's fallen in love with. So he had already killed the girl Adele. He now, in Adele's body, ends up killing Louise and invading Louise's body, who's now having a sexual relationship with David. So by the end of the book, the teenage gay boy from the psychiatric hospital has killed Adele and has killed Louise, their physical bodies, and their souls have left, and he's actually invaded Louise's body, so now he's having the relationship with David that he's always wanted. I could not believe this. I was so pissed at the end of this book. This is a contemporary thriller. You do not end a contemporary thriller with a paranormal climax. It's like, what the hell did I just read? This was not a payoff. Now, I am old enough to remember the climax and the cliffhanger in the show Dallas in the 80s, where it was Bobby is in the shower and all of a sudden, it was all a dream. It was all a dream. WTF. This book was awful. You cannot end a contemporary thriller with a paranormal climax. It's too easy of an ending. It's too convenient of a tie-up. I even had to look into the author to see, is this her specialty? Is her expertise paranormal thrillers? No. So why was that the ending? Don't do that to the reader, because if I'm reading a contemporary story set that I am not spoiled in the blurb as being some sort of magical realism paranormal book, I want an ending. I want a wrap up that makes sense. And this was a story of a triangular relationship that could have been resolved in a real way. It was not. And I felt cheated, and I felt the payoff was not worth it. And this was one of those books I finished and threw. No.